She laughed when she said his name. That was the part that broke him. Not the words themselves, though the words were bad enough, but the way she laughed, light and easy, the way a person laughs when they're talking about something that doesn't really matter. And Evan Mercer was standing 15 feet away, holding 12 red roses wrapped in brown paper, watching his wife of 9 years laugh about him to her best friend like he was a footnote in her own story. She didn't see him. That was the thing. She had no idea he was there. And in the 90 seconds that followed, Evan learned that the woman he had built his entire adult life around had never once planned to stay. If this story already has your attention, you're in the right place. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and drop a comment below telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit the like button, stay until the end, because this one goes places you won't see coming. The roses were his idea. That was the thing Evan kept coming back to afterward, in the days and weeks that followed. When he was sitting alone in the garage with the radio on low and a wrench in his hand he wasn't actually using. The roses were entirely his idea. Sabrina hadn't asked him to come. She hadn't even told him which flight she was on. He'd looked it up himself, dug through the shared calendar on his phone, found the airline confirmation she'd forwarded to their joint email, and figured out the arrival time on his own. He'd even left work early for it. Evan worked in structural engineering, had for 16 years, and leaving early was not something he did casually. His project manager had raised an eyebrow when Evan said he had a personal thing to take care of, and Evan had felt slightly embarrassed explaining that he was picking up his wife at the airport. It sounded soft. He knew it sounded soft. But he and Sabrina had been in a rough patch. Nothing he could name exactly, just a kind of distance that had settled between them over the past year. A low-grade chill he kept telling himself was just stress, and he thought the gesture might help. Flowers. A familiar face waiting at arrivals. Something to remind her that he was still paying attention. He'd bought the roses at a shop near his office. 12 of them, red, wrapped in brown craft paper with a little sprig of eucalyptus the florist had tucked in without being asked. The florist was a heavy-set man in his 60s who'd said, without looking up, "Somebody's in trouble." And Evan had laughed and said no, he just wanted to do something nice. The man had looked at him then, briefly, with an expression Evan couldn't quite read, and handed over the bouquet. Traffic was bad on the bridge, so Evan was later than he'd planned. He parked in the short-term lot, jogged to the terminal, and checked the arrivals board. Her flight had landed 11 minutes ago. He moved quickly through the crowd toward baggage claim, scanning faces, and that was when he heard her. Sabrina had a specific laugh. It was something he'd noticed when they first met. A real laugh, not polished, slightly too loud for quiet rooms, the kind of laugh that came from her chest instead of her throat. He'd loved that about her once. He heard it before he saw her, cutting through the noise of the baggage claim area, and he turned toward the sound automatically, the way you turn toward something familiar. She was standing near the far carousel with Marissa Bell. Marissa was her oldest friend, someone Evan had known for nearly as long as he'd known Sabrina, a small, sharp-featured woman who worked in marketing and had never quite warmed to him. They were both in travel clothes, pulling roller bags, clearly in the middle of a conversation. Evan took a step toward them, and then he heard his name. "Evan's fine," Sabrina was saying. "He's just, he's Evan." He stopped walking. "What does that mean?" Marissa asked. "It means he's safe." Sabrina said the word the way you'd describe a piece of furniture. Solid, functional, nothing more. "He's dependable. He's not going anywhere. That's why I'm with him." Evan stood still. The roses were in his right hand. He was aware of them suddenly in a way he hadn't been before, aware of how they looked, aware of himself standing there with them. "But do you actually—" Marissa started. "Love him?" Sabrina finished. She paused. Not a long pause, but long enough. "I love that he's steady. I love that he doesn't create chaos. But is he the person I would choose if I were choosing right now, from scratch?" She laughed again, softer this time. "Honestly, probably not." Evan didn't move. Someone bumped his shoulder from behind and apologized and kept walking. He didn't respond. "Then why are you still there?" Marissa asked. Sabrina's voice dropped slightly, but the baggage claim area was not as loud as it should have been in that moment, and Evan heard every word. "Because Vale Collective is not there yet," she said. "When I started the company, I needed stability. I needed someone who wasn't going to blow up every 6 months. And Evan, his credit, his family trust, his contacts, his willingness to co-sign things without asking too many questions. All of that gave me a foundation I couldn't have built without. So yes, I'm still there. For now. Marissa was quiet for a second. And when the company gets there, Sabrina picked up the handle of her roller bag. Then I figure out the next part. Evan's hand tightened around the paper wrapping of the roses. He had his phone in his left jacket pocket. He didn't make a conscious decision to record the conversation. It was more like his body made the decision before his brain caught up, his hand moving to his pocket, opening the voice memo app, pressing the button. He didn't know why exactly. Some cold, functional part of him understood that what he was hearing mattered, that it was the kind of thing that needed to exist somewhere outside his own memory, where he couldn't convince himself later that he'd misheard or misunderstood. He stood there for another 2 minutes. Sabrina told Marissa that she'd already consulted an attorney, not for the divorce, she didn't call it that, but to understand her position was how she put it. She mentioned Evan's family trust specifically, the one his father had set up before he died, and said she'd wanted to know whether there was anything in the marriage that would give her access to it if things became complicated. The attorney had told her probably not, given how the trust was structured, but she was still looking into it. "You're being very strategic," Marissa said. "I'm being practical," Sabrina said. "There's a difference." Evan stopped recording. He looked down at the roses. He looked at his wife, at the back of her head, at the way she was standing, easy and relaxed, the same woman he'd eaten breakfast with 4 days ago, the same woman whose dry cleaning he'd picked up last Tuesday without being asked. He looked at her for a long time. Then he set the roses down on a nearby empty cart, laid them flat, the craft paper crinkling slightly. He didn't leave them standing upright. He didn't arrange them. He just set them down. And then he walked back out of the terminal the same way he'd come in. He sat in his car in the short-term lot for a while before driving. He didn't cry. He didn't feel the sharp, dramatic wave of emotion he might have expected. What he felt was more like the specific sensation of a floor giving way. Not the fall, but the moment just before it, when your foot finds nothing where something should be, and your body understands what's about to happen before your mind does. 9 years. He ran the math without wanting to. They'd met when Evan was 33, at a mutual friend's birthday dinner. Sabrina had been 30, working at a small design firm, full of ideas she talked about with her hands moving constantly, and Evan had been drawn in immediately. By the ideas, by the movement, by the realness of her. She wasn't performing. That was what he'd thought. She's just genuinely herself. He had proposed on a Tuesday, not a special occasion, just a regular Tuesday evening when they were doing dishes, and he'd looked at her and thought, this is it, this is the person, and the words had come out before he'd had time to arrange them properly. She'd said yes and then laughed at how badly he'd phrased it, and he'd laughed too, and it had felt like the most honest moment of his life. He sat in the car and played the recording back once. He made himself listen to all of it. He's safe, he's dependable, he's not going anywhere. He understood, sitting there, that these were not things she had said in a moment of frustration. She wasn't venting. She wasn't exaggerating because she was tired from traveling. She was explaining herself to her oldest friend in a level, matter-of-fact tone, the way you explain a decision you've thought through carefully and made your peace with. He drove home. Manmada dinner. Pasta. Nothing complicated. And he ate it at the kitchen counter and washed the dish and went to bed. When Sabrina came home 2 hours later, smelling like the airport, and tired from the trip, he said hello and asked how the conference had been. She said fine, and told him a story about the hotel having the wrong reservation, some minor inconvenience that she'd handled. He listened and nodded in the right places. She did not mention the roses. She hadn't seen them, or if she had, she hadn't known they were his. He didn't sleep well that night, but he didn't let it show. The next 3 days were the strangest of his life, and not for the reasons he would have expected. He had assumed, vaguely, that he would feel rage, or grief. Something large and consuming that would make it impossible to function. Instead, what he felt was clarity. A cold, uncomfortable clarity, like stepping outside in winter and breathing air that's too sharp. Everything was suddenly very specific and very visible. He started paying attention to things he had ignored. On the second day, he logged into their joint banking account, something he technically always had access to but rarely checked in detail. And he spent an hour going through the last 14 months of transactions. What he found wasn't dramatic. There was no smoking gun, no obvious theft. But there were patterns. Business expenses paid from the joint account that should have gone through Vail Collective's corporate card. A consulting fee paid to a vendor he didn't recognize, a significant one, listed in the joint account under a category that didn't make sense. A transfer to a savings account he hadn't known existed. He made a spreadsheet. He documented everything quietly, methodically, the way he would approach a load-bearing structure he suspected was compromised. You don't guess. You measure. You document. You find out exactly what you're dealing with before you do anything. On the third day, he called Marcus Hale. He'd known Marcus for years. They'd gone to the same college, ran in overlapping circles, had the kind of friendship that went dormant for stretches, but picked up reliably when needed. Marcus was a family attorney now, had been for over a decade, and Evan had always thought vaguely that he was good at his job without ever expecting to need him personally. "I need to talk to you," Evan said when Marcus picked up. "Not as a friend. Professionally." Marcus was quiet for a second. "How bad?" "I don't know yet," Evan said. "That's actually the problem." They met for coffee the following morning, a Thursday, at a place near Marcus's office that was noisy enough to make being overheard unlikely. Evan brought his laptop and the spreadsheet. He told Marcus everything: the airport, the recording, the financial records, the name of the attorney Sabrina had apparently consulted. He told it plainly, without editorializing, the way he would brief a client. Marcus listened. He didn't interrupt. When Evan finished, he sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "Okay," he said finally. "That's it? Okay?" "I'm processing." Marcus pulled the laptop toward him and looked at the spreadsheet. "She actually said the family trust by name. She said she'd consulted an attorney to understand her position if things became complicated. The trust was specifically mentioned." Marcus nodded slowly. "All right, first thing, the trust is probably fine. Depending on how your father structured it, if it was set up before the marriage and you've kept it properly separate, she's very unlikely to have any claim on it. But we need to look at the actual documents." "I have them. I've had them for years. My father's attorney gave me a complete copy when the trust was established." "Good." Marcus leaned forward. "Now here's what you're not going to do. You're not going to confront her. You're not going to change your behavior at home. You're not going to move money, cancel accounts, or do anything that looks like you're hiding assets, because that creates problems for you legally. You're going to behave exactly as you have been, and you're going to let me start building a clear picture of where everything actually stands." Evan looked at him. "And the recording?" "Admissibility depends on state law, but the value isn't necessarily in the courtroom. It's in what it tells us about intent. It helps explain the financial patterns." Marcus paused. "Evan, I want to be straight with you. What you found in those records isn't technically theft. She may have had reasons for those transactions that she'd argue were legitimate. But the combination, the records, the recording, the fact that she's already spoken to an attorney, it paints a picture of someone who's been running a parallel plan for a while." "I know," Evan said. "And you're okay?" Evan thought about how to answer that. "I'm functional," he said finally. "That's probably the best I can tell you right now." Marcus looked at him steadily. "You know what she said about you isn't true, right? The part about why you're valuable." "I know," Evan said again. And he did know. He knew it intellectually. Whether he felt it was a different question, one he didn't particularly want to examine in a coffee shop on a Thursday morning. "What?" "I went home that evening, and Sabrina was already there, working at the kitchen table with her laptop open and papers spread around her. She looked focused, a little frantic. The launch of Vail Collective was 8 weeks out, and there was always something. "How was your day?" she asked, without looking up. "Fine," Evan said. "You eat?" "Not yet. I was going to order something." "I'll make something," he said. He cooked dinner. He sat across from her while they ate, and she talked about a vendor problem she was dealing with, some issue with the catering setup for the launch event. He listened and offered a practical suggestion, and she nodded and wrote something down. She did not look at him the way she had when they first got together. But she hadn't looked at him that way in a long time, and until 4 days ago he had been telling himself it was just the natural settling of a long marriage. That it happened to everyone. That it didn't mean anything was wrong. He watched her across the table and thought about the woman at the airport, laughing about his name. He thought about his father's Impala in the garage, halfway through a restoration that had been stalled for 2 years. He thought about the fact that for 9 years he had been, in some essential way, building someone else's life. He cleared the dishes. He washed the pan. He said goodnight when she finally came to bed, turned away from him, her breathing evening out within minutes. He lay in the dark for a long time. He was not planning to save the marriage. That realization landed quietly, without ceremony. He wasn't sure exactly when it had settled into place, sometime between the airport and the kitchen table, but it was there now, solid and unambiguous. He was not going to save the marriage. I was going to protect himself. And for the first time in longer than he could accurately remember, that felt like the right decision. The spreadsheet had grown to 4 tabs by the end of the second week. Evan hadn't planned it that way. He'd started with the joint checking account, just to get a clear picture, and then one thing had led to another, the way it always does when you start actually looking at something you've been ignoring. The checking account pointed to the savings account. The savings account had transfers that connected to a credit line he hadn't known existed. The credit line had a billing address that wasn't their home. He worked on it late at night, after Sabrina went to bed, sitting at the desk in the spare room with the door closed and his reading glasses on. He was methodical about it, the same way he was methodical about everything structural. You start with what you can verify, you document your sources, you don't assume, you follow the load path and see where it goes. He wasn't looking for reasons to be angry. He was looking for the actual shape of what had happened. By the end of the second week, the shape was becoming clear. Veil Collective had been officially incorporated 3 years ago, but Sabrina had been developing the concept for at least a year before that, maybe longer. Evan knew this. He'd been there for the early conversations, the late-night planning sessions at the kitchen table. The moment she'd first said the name out loud and asked him what he thought. He'd thought it was good. He'd told her so. He'd believed in it. What he hadn't fully understood until now was the degree to which the company's early infrastructure had been built on his personal financial foundation rather than Sabrina's own. His credit had been used for 3 business loans, all of which he'd co-signed, 2 of which he didn't remember the exact terms of because he'd trusted her when she said they were standard. His home equity, their home equity technically, but the house had been his before the marriage, purchased with money his father had helped him with, had been used as collateral on a line of credit that had funded Veil Collective's first real operating year. His family contacts, people he'd known through his father and through years of professional work, had been introduced to Sabrina at his suggestion, several of whom had become early clients or referral sources for the company. None of this was secret. None of it had been done without his knowledge, in the technical sense. He had signed things. He had made introductions. He had said yes when she asked. But he understood now that he had said yes without fully understanding what he was saying yes to. He had trusted the context, the marriage, the partnership, the mutual investment in a shared future. And that context had been, from her perspective at least, something different than what he'd believed it was. He sent Marcus everything in a compressed folder on a Sunday night with a message that just said, "Updated records. Call me when you've had a chance to look." Marcus called Monday morning, earlier than Evan expected. "You've been busy," Marcus said. "I had some quiet evenings." "I'm looking at this credit line." There was a pause, the sound of Marcus clicking through files. "Did she ever discuss this with you directly, as a business instrument?" "She mentioned needing additional liquidity around the time she was hiring her first 2 full-time staff. I remember the conversation in general terms, but not the specific numbers." "The specific numbers are significant, Evan." "I figured." Another pause. "Okay, here's where we are. The trust is clean. I've looked at your father's documents and the structure is solid. It was established before the marriage, you've never commingled those funds, and there's no provision in your marriage that would give her a legitimate claim on it. She might argue for something, but she'd lose. That's almost certain." Evan exhaled slowly. The trust was the thing he'd been most worried about, not for himself specifically, but because of what it represented. His father had built it carefully, over years, with the specific intention of passing something intact to the next generation. The idea of it being picked apart in a divorce proceeding had sat in Evan's chest like a stone since the airport. "And the rest?" he said. "More complicated. The co-signed loans are your legal obligation as much as hers. The home equity line, that's going to require some untangling, But here's the thing. Marcus paused again, and Evan had learned in the past 2 weeks that Marcus's pauses meant he was choosing words carefully. The pattern you've documented, combined with what's on that recording, tells a story. It's not a story that makes her look good, and in a divorce proceeding, story matters. I'm not interested in destroying her, Evan said. It was important to him that Marcus understood this. I'm interested in making sure I'm not the one who gets destroyed. I know. And those two things are compatible. Marcus's voice was steady, practical. But I want you to be clear-eyed about one thing. She's already talked to an attorney, which means she's already been given advice about how to position herself, which means she may be doing her own version of what you're doing right now and building a record, establishing a narrative. Evan hadn't fully considered this. He sat with it for a moment. So what do I do? Keep doing exactly what you're doing. Document, preserve, don't confront. And I want you to pull together anything that shows your independent contributions to the marriage. The house purchase records, the original loan documents, correspondence that establishes the timeline of what you brought in versus what she did. Not to attack her, to establish your own position clearly. After he hung up, Evan sat in his car in the office parking lot for a few minutes before going inside. It was a gray morning, the kind where the light never quite arrives, just stays flat and pale all day. He thought about the loan documents. He thought about the introductions he'd made, the dinners he'd hosted for her early clients, the weekend he'd spent helping her move equipment into Vail Collective's first office space because they couldn't afford movers yet. He thought about how willing he had been, how completely, genuinely willing. He went inside and did his job. The name Julian Cross came up on a Thursday. Evan found it by accident, which was both better and worse than finding it on purpose. He wasn't looking for evidence of an affair. That wasn't what the spreadsheet was about, and he'd made a conscious decision not to go digging in that direction because he didn't think he could handle it and remain functional. But he was cross-referencing some of the Vail Collective vendor records against public business filings, just to understand the company's structure better, and Julian Cross appeared as a listed consultant on 2 of the company's early contracts. He looked up the name. It was easy enough. Julian Cross had a professional website, a LinkedIn profile, the usual footprint. He was in brand development, based in the same city, mid-40s, the kind of person whose professional photo looked like it had been taken by someone who knew what they were doing. Evan looked at the photo for a moment and then closed the tab. He cross-referenced the name against the joint account records. Julian Cross had been paid through Vail Collective for consulting work over a period of 18 months. The payments were legitimate business expenses, documented correctly, nothing hidden. Evan stared at the dates. The first payment was dated 4 months after Sabrina had told Evan she loved him at a specific moment he still remembered. They'd been at a friend's wedding, the reception was winding down, and she'd leaned against him and said it quietly, not as a reflex, but as if she meant it. He had believed her completely. He closed the laptop and went to the garage. The Impala was where it always was, partially disassembled, the engine pulled and sitting on a stand to the side. His father had started the restoration project and gotten about 40% of the way through before his health had made it impossible to continue. Evan had inherited the car and the project both, and for a while he'd worked on it consistently, spending weekends in the garage with the radio on and grease on his hands, making slow progress. Then the marriage had gotten busier and the weekends had gotten smaller, and the project had stalled. He hadn't touched it in almost 2 years. He didn't work on it that night either. He just sat on a stool near the workbench and looked at the car for a while. The garage smelled like oil and concrete and the faint metallic smell of old tools. His father had smelled like that sometimes, coming in from a long afternoon in his own garage. It was one of those sensory memories that hits you without warning, specific and total. His father would have known what to do. Not because he was wise in any cinematic sense. He was a practical man, impatient, sometimes too blunt, the kind of person who had a hard time sitting still, but because he had a clear, unambiguous sense of what he valued and what he wouldn't tolerate. He didn't overthink things. He made decisions based on what was real and then lived with them. Evan had inherited his father's capacity for patience and his mother's capacity for doubt. It was, he reflected, not always a useful combination. He went back inside and called Marcus and left a voicemail saying there was a name he needed to discuss, a consultant connected to the company and he'd explain more in the morning. Marcus's response to the Julian Cross information was characteristically measured. "Do you want to know?" he asked. They were back at the same coffee shop, same corner table. It was starting to feel like their office. "What do you mean?" "I mean, do you want to pursue whether there's something personal there, or do you want to focus on the financial and legal picture? Because those are two different conversations, and one of them is going to cost you more, emotionally, not financially." Evan thought about it honestly. "I don't think I need to know the details," he said finally. "I heard enough at the airport. She said she doesn't want to be with me. Whether or not she's with someone else doesn't change what I'm doing." Marcus nodded. "That's a reasonable position. But I need to know if it affects anything legally. It might affect the narrative, as I said. If there's evidence of an ongoing relationship during the marriage, that's relevant context. But I wouldn't chase it right now. What you have is already significant." Evan picked up his coffee cup and put it down again without drinking. "She mentioned him. Not by name, but she mentioned someone." He said it slowly, working it out as he spoke. "At the airport, when she was talking to Marissa, she said something about, I didn't include it in the recording notes because I didn't think it mattered at the time. She said there was someone who made her feel more herself, or more alive, something like that." Marcus was quiet. "I didn't ask myself who she meant," Evan said. "I think I didn't want to know. I was already processing enough." "And now?" "Now I think it's probably him. And I think it's probably been going on for a while." He was surprised by how steady his voice was. "And I think I need to just sit with that without doing anything about it, because there's nothing useful to do about it right now." Marcus looked at him with something that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite admiration. It was closer to the expression of someone watching a person do something genuinely hard and not flinching. "Okay," Marcus said, "then we focus on what we can control." What they could control, Marcus laid out carefully over the next hour, was the financial picture. The co-signed loans could be addressed in the divorce settlement. Evan's exposure could be clearly documented and a fair allocation negotiated. The home equity line was more complex but manageable, given that Evan could establish the house's original ownership. The family trust was protected. The records Evan had compiled created a clear timeline of his contributions to the marriage and to Vail Collective's early development, contributions that had real, demonstrable financial value. "I want you to think about one more thing," Marcus said as they were getting up to leave. "The launch event. For the company." Evan frowned. "What about it?" "She's still planning it?" "Yes, 6 weeks out. It's all she's working on right now." He paused. "She has no idea I know anything." "I know. And I'm not suggesting you do anything about the launch." Marcus pulled on his jacket. "I'm just noting that the launch is the moment when Vail Collective becomes a public entity in a significant way. It's when the investors formalize, when the brand becomes real, when everything she's built becomes something she'd want to protect at all costs." He looked at Evan directly. "If a divorce filing comes at the wrong moment relative to that event, it could be significant for her. I'm not trying to destroy the company, Marcus. I know you're not, but I want you to understand the full picture of what's happening so you're making choices with your eyes open." Evan thought about it on the drive home. He wasn't interested in timing a legal action to coincide with a public event for strategic damage. That wasn't who he was. He'd said it to Marcus and he meant it, but he also understood, sitting in traffic on the bridge, that there was a difference between what he was willing to do and what was going to happen regardless. He had a recording. He had financial records. He had 9 years of a marriage that had been, from one perspective at least, a structured arrangement that he'd walked into believing it was something else. Whatever happened from here was going to be a consequence of what was real, not of what he chose to do with it. Living in the house during those 6 weeks was the strangest performance of his life. He was good at it, which surprised him. He'd always thought of himself as a bad liar, too straightforward, too apt to let things show on his face. But it turned out that not lying was different from not revealing. He didn't say anything false. He didn't pretend to be happy. He was simply present in the way he'd always been present, because Sabrina wasn't paying close enough attention to notice that something had shifted. That was the thing that kept snagging in him. She wasn't watching him. She'd never been watching him. He'd been a stable feature in her environment, useful and constant, and stable features don't need monitoring. He cooked dinner most nights. He did the grocery shopping. He kept the house in the way he'd always kept it, because his father had been the kind of man who believed that what you did every day was who you were, and that had gotten into Evan early and never left. He maintained the lawn. He paid the bills that went through their joint account, the ones that were genuinely shared. He slept on his side of the bed. Sabrina talked about the launch constantly. It was all she had bandwidth for. The venue, the investor presentations, the press, the catering situation she'd mentioned that first night, the keynote she was writing and rewriting. She ran her drafts by him sometimes, out of habit, or maybe just because she needed a body in the room to talk at, and he gave honest feedback because there was no reason not to. The keynote was actually good. She had always been good at articulating what she was building. Once, about 3 weeks in, she looked at him across the kitchen table with an expression he couldn't quite read and said, "You've been quiet." "Have I?" He kept his voice neutral. "More than usual." She studied him for a second. "Is something going on at work?" "Some project complications. Nothing major." She nodded, and he could see her interest shift back to her own screen before she'd even finished the nod. It wasn't cruelty. It was just where she was. He thought about the man who had driven to an airport with 12 roses 3 weeks ago. That man had believed genuinely that the gesture would mean something, that it was the kind of thing that could shift the temperature of a marriage. He hadn't thought of himself as naive then. He thought of himself as someone who still believed in trying. He wasn't sure what he believed now exactly. He was still working that out. He called his sister Donna one evening from the garage. Donna lived in another state, was 2 years younger than Evan, and had always had a sharper eye for people than he did. He didn't tell her everything. He didn't want to have the full conversation yet, didn't want to say the words out loud to someone in his personal life before the legal side was further along. But he told her enough. "How long have you known?" she asked. "About 3 weeks. And you haven't said anything to her?" "No." A long pause. "That's actually very unlike you, Evan. I know. But also probably correct." He could hear her moving around her kitchen, the sound of something being set on a counter. "Are you okay?" "I'm functional." "That's what you say when you're not okay." "I know," he said again. "I'll be better when I'm through it. Right now I'm just in it." Donna didn't push. She'd always known when to and when not to. She asked a few practical questions. Did he have a good attorney? Was he documenting things properly? Had he talked to anyone else about it? And he answered them. Before she hung up, she said, "Dad would be furious, by the way. Just for the record." Evan laughed. It was the first time he'd laughed in weeks, and it surprised him. "Yeah," he said. "I know he would." He sat in the garage after the call, alone with the Impala and the flat light from the single overhead bulb. The car looked back at him the way unfinished things do, patient, slightly accusatory, full of potential that hasn't been acted on. He picked up a wrench. He didn't do anything complicated that night. He cleaned a few components, checked some fittings, got reacquainted with where things stood. But he worked for almost 2 hours, and when he finally put the tools away and turned off the light, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not better, exactly. Not repaired. Just present. In his own life, in his own space, doing something that was his entirely, that no one had asked him to do and no one was benefiting from except himself. He locked the garage and went inside and went to bed. 4 weeks until the launch. The invitations had gone out 6 weeks earlier, and by the night of the launch, every one of the 212 confirmed guests had responded yes. Evan knew the number because Sabrina had told him 3 separate times, each time with the particular energy of someone who has been working toward a thing for so long that when it finally arrives, they can't quite believe the size of it. 212 people. Investors, community leaders, potential clients, a handful of journalists from local business publications, representatives from 2 regional industry organizations. Evelyn Vale, Sabrina's mother, who had been one of the company's earliest and most vocal supporters, lending her name and her social network to the enterprise from the very beginning. The venue was a converted warehouse space in the arts district that Vale Collective had rented for the evening. High ceilings, exposed brick, the kind of place that said serious creative business without trying too hard. Sabrina had agonized over it for weeks. She'd also agonized over the lighting, the catering, the arrangement of the presentation space, the font on the printed materials. Evan had watched all of it from the periphery of her attention, steady and unremarked upon. The way furniture is unremarked upon. He had told Marcus about his decision 2 weeks before the launch, sitting in the coffee shop that had become their regular meeting point. "I'm going to the event," Evan said. Marcus had looked at him carefully. "As a guest? She invited you?" "She assumed I'd be there. I'm her husband. It would be strange if I wasn't." He paused. "And I want to be there. Not for a reason she'd expect, but I want to be in the room." Marcus set down his cup. "Evan, I'm not going to do anything impulsive. I've thought about this for 2 weeks and I'm not being impulsive." "Walk me through it." Evan had, in fact, spent 2 weeks thinking through exactly this conversation. He'd run the scenario from multiple angles: what it would look like, what it would cost him, whether it was the right thing to do or just the satisfying thing, which were not always the same. He'd sat in the garage with the Impala 3 nights in a row and argued with himself about it. "She has built this company on a foundation she didn't disclose," he said. "She used my credit, my collateral, my contacts, and my trust to do it. The people in that room, the investors, the clients, the press, they're about to commit to something based on a version of this company that doesn't include that information. Her mother is going to stand there and endorse a business built in part through a marriage that was, from Sabrina's own account, a strategic arrangement." He looked at Marcus steadily. "I have a recording. I have records. And I have been quiet for 6 weeks. You've been quiet for strategic reasons." "Yes. And now I think the strategy has run its course." Marcus leaned back. He was quiet for a long moment. "If you do this at the event, in front of that crowd, it's not a controlled disclosure. It's a public one that changes the nature of everything that follows. The divorce proceedings, the financial negotiations, how she responds, all of it gets more complicated." "I know. It also means she won't be able to pretend she didn't know this was coming. She won't be able to position herself as the wrong party in a surprise divorce filing. The record becomes completely public." "I know that too." Another long pause. "What does she know about you being at the event?" "She expects me there. I told her last week that I'd be coming. She said good, and then went back to reviewing the catering invoice." He said it without bitterness, just as fact. Marcus drummed his fingers once on the table. "You understand I can't advise you to do this, as your attorney." "I understand. And I can't stop you from doing it as your friend, because I've known you long enough to know that when you've thought something through this carefully, you've already made the decision." Evan didn't say anything. "Just don't do anything that could be characterized as harassment or threatening behavior," Marcus said. "Whatever you say it calmly, and then walk away." The night of the launch was a Wednesday in early November, cool and clear, the city doing that thing it sometimes did in autumn, where the air felt cleaner than it had any right to be. Evan drove himself. He wore the gray suit he'd bought 2 years ago for a colleague's retirement dinner. Not new, not remarkable, just a suit that fit correctly. He arrived 20 minutes after the doors opened, when the room was already filling and the ambient noise had reached that level where individual conversations blurred into general sound. The space looked the way Sabrina had wanted it to look. She'd been right about the venue, he'd give her that. The lighting was warm and specific, the kind that makes everyone look slightly better than they do in daylight. A small stage had been set up at the far end of the room with a podium and a large display screen behind it. The Vail Collective logo was projected on the screen, clean and modern, the product of months of design work that Evan had watched her agonize over. He took a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray and moved through the room slowly. He saw Evelyn Vail near the entrance, holding court with a small group of people Evan recognized vaguely as community figures: a city council member, the director of a local arts foundation, a woman who ran a regional business association. Evelyn was in her late 60s, a tall woman with Sabrina's bearing and her own particular version of Sabrina's social confidence. More practiced, less hungry, the ease of someone who'd been comfortable in rooms like this for decades. She saw Evan and smiled. "Evan," she said, breaking from the group momentarily, "I'm so glad you're here. Isn't this wonderful?" "It's a good room," he said, and then, because it was true, she worked hard for this. Evelyn's face softened with the particular pride of a mother who has watched her child build something. "She really has. I know it hasn't always been easy, with everything she's been juggling." She touched his arm briefly. "You've been a good support to her. I hope you know that." Evan looked at Evelyn Vail and felt something complicated move through him. She meant it. He could see that she meant it, and he understood that she was going to mean it even more in about 40 minutes, except it was going to be directed somewhere else entirely. "Thank you, Evelyn," he said. He moved on. He found a position near the side of the room, slightly back from the main crowd, where he had a clear sightline to the stage. He could see the entrance, the cluster of investors near the far wall, the table where the printed materials were laid out. He could see Marissa Bell moving through the crowd with the focused energy of someone who has been assigned a task, checking in with people, directing minor traffic. She was helping with the event. Of course she was. He saw Julian Cross from across the room. He'd known Cross might be there. It was the kind of event that invited key consultants and collaborators. But seeing him in person was different from looking at a professional photo on a website. Cross was taller than Evan had imagined, well-dressed in a way that suggested careful attention without appearing to try, and he moved through the room with the ease of someone who was comfortable being in rooms. He was talking to a group near the investor's corner, laughing at something someone had said, and Evan watched him for a moment and then looked away. He felt something standing there. I was honest enough with himself to name it. It wasn't quite jealousy, because jealousy requires a sense of entitlement to something you're losing, and Evan understood now that what he'd believed he had was never entirely real. It was closer to grief. Not for the marriage exactly, but for the man he'd been in it. The man who had co-signed loans and made introductions and driven to airports with flowers, genuinely believing that all of it was reciprocal. He finished his water. Sabrina found him about 15 minutes before the program was supposed to start. She materialized out of the crowd looking flushed and focused, her event face on, the one that was turned up several degrees from normal, brighter, and more deliberate. "You made it," she said. "I said I would." "I know, She glanced around the room, cataloging something. "There's a thing with the AV setup. I need to sort it in the next 10 minutes, but I wanted to say hi." "The room looks good," he said. "You were right about the venue." She looked at him for a second, something flickering across her expression that he couldn't read. Surprise, maybe, at the specific compliment. "Thank you." She touched his arm, the same brief social touch her mother had used, and then she was moving again, back into the current of the evening. He watched her go. He thought about a Tuesday evening in their first apartment, the two of them doing dishes after dinner, his hands wet and the words coming out before he'd arranged them properly. He thought about her laughing at how badly he'd phrased it. He thought about how that laugh had sounded, and how it had been completely different from the laugh at the airport, and how he hadn't understood that two people could have such different versions of the same 9 years until 6 weeks ago. The program started at 8:15. There were brief remarks from one of the investors, a polished, efficient man who talked about Vail Collective's market positioning with the fluency of someone who'd read the prospectus multiple times and believed it. Then a representative from the Regional Business Association said a few words about the company's contribution to the local creative economy. Then Evelyn Vail stepped to the podium. She was good at this. Evan had always known that. Evelyn had a natural authority that didn't require volume, the kind of presence that makes a room settle into attention without her having to ask. She spoke about watching Sabrina develop her vision over years, about the resilience it took to build something real, about the importance of the Vail name as a symbol of community investment and integrity. The room was attentive and warm. Evan was standing at the side of the room, slightly behind the main crowd, his hands in his jacket pockets. His phone was in his right hand. The voice memo with the recording from the airport was already queued up. The external speaker he'd brought, small, flat, powerful enough for a room of this size, was in his left jacket pocket. He'd tested it twice in the garage the night before. He had gone back and forth about this more times than he could count. He wasn't a person who did dramatic things. He wasn't by nature someone who sought confrontation or public scenes. He had spent 9 years being the person in the room who didn't create problems. But he had also spent 9 years being useful to someone who had decided, at some point, that useful was the same as dispensable. And there were 212 people in this room who were about to invest their trust, their money, or their professional reputation in a company whose founding story had a significant piece missing. Evelyn finished her remarks to genuine applause and then introduced Sabrina. Sabrina walked to the stage. She was composed, more composed than Evan had ever seen her at a moment of high stakes, and he'd seen her at a lot of them. She adjusted the podium microphone slightly, looked out at the room, and began. She was good. He had to keep acknowledging that to himself, because it was true, and truth was what he was operating on. She spoke clearly about the company's mission, her vision for where it was going, the specific value it offered that no other firm in the market currently provided. She was specific, confident, and occasionally self-deprecating in the way that reads as charm rather than weakness. The room was with her. She was 4 minutes into the keynote when Evan walked onto the stage. He didn't rush. He didn't announce himself. He simply walked up the 3 steps at the side of the stage and crossed to the podium with the particular deliberateness of someone who has decided to do a thing and is doing it. Sabrina saw him when he was about 6 feet away. Her face went through several things in rapid succession. Confusion first, then a flash of irritation that she tried to suppress, then something else, something uncertain, because his expression was not what she expected it to be. "Evan," she said, quietly, into the live microphone. The room heard it. "There's something the room should hear before we go further," he said. He said it calmly, to the crowd, and to her equally, because Marcus had said say it calmly, and he intended to. "Evan, this is—" She reached for the microphone. He had already placed the small speaker on the podium and pressed play. Her voice came out of it clear and immediate. The room-sized speaker he'd tested in the garage was doing exactly what it was supposed to do. The audio was audible across the full space, not perfectly crisp, but clear enough. Her voice, recognizably hers, filled the room. "He's safe. He's dependable. He's not going anywhere. That's why I'm with him." The room, which had been ambient and murmuring, went very quiet. Is he the person I would choose if I were choosing right now, from scratch? Honestly? Probably not. Sabrina had gone still. She was looking at him with an expression he had never seen on her face before. Not anger, not exactly, something more primary than that. The recording continued. Because Veil Collective is not there yet. When I started the company, I needed stability. I needed someone who wasn't going to blow up every 6 months. And Evan, his credit, his family trust, his contacts, his willingness to co-sign things without asking too many questions. All of that gave me a foundation I couldn't have built without. So yes, I'm still there. For now. Marissa Bell, standing at the edge of the crowd, had gone the color of old paper. Julian Cross had stopped moving entirely. The recording reached its end, the moment where Sabrina picked up her roller bag and said, "Then I figure out the next part." And the small speaker went silent. The room stayed silent for another several seconds. Evan reached out and picked up the speaker. He looked at the crowd, the investors, the community figures, the journalists, Evelyn Vale standing to the side of the stage with her hand at her collar, frozen. "I thought you should know what this company was built on before you decide to trust it," he said. He kept his voice even. "That's all." Then he walked back down the 3 steps and through the crowd, which parted for him without being asked, and out the side exit into the cool November night. He sat in his car in the parking lot. He didn't feel the way he'd expected to feel. He'd imagined, in the weeks of thinking it over, that there would be some surge of something, release maybe, or satisfaction, or the particular exhausted relief of a thing finally said. Instead, he felt very still. Not numb exactly, just still. He could hear faintly through the building's walls and the parking lot noise the sound of raised voices. Not a crowd reacting, individual voices, the specific sound of a situation coming apart. He sat and listened to it from the outside and thought about Evelyn Vale's face in the moment after the recording stopped. He hadn't planned on her. He'd thought about the investors and the press and Sabrina, and he'd thought about Marissa, but he hadn't fully calculated what it would mean for Evelyn to be standing in that room. Evelyn, who had lent her name and her reputation because she believed in her daughter's vision and hadn't known what was underneath it. That part sat in him uncomfortably. Not regret exactly. He'd known she'd be there. He'd known she'd hear it. But there was a difference between knowing something abstractly and watching an older woman's face go through what Evelyn's face had gone through, and he was honest enough to acknowledge that it was harder than he'd anticipated. His phone started receiving messages. He silenced it without reading them. After about 20 minutes, the side exit opened and a figure came through it. He recognized the posture before he saw the face. The particular way Sabrina held herself when she was trying very hard to hold everything together. She stood outside the door for a moment without looking toward the parking lot, Then she sat down on the concrete step outside the exit and put her face in her hands. He watched her through the windshield. He didn't get out. After a few minutes, she lifted her head, looked around, and saw his car. She stood up. She walked toward him. He lowered the window. She stood at the car with her arms wrapped around herself, her event composure entirely gone, her face stripped down to something raw and unmanaged. "How long?" she said. Not a question exactly, more like a statement that needed finishing. 6 weeks, he said. "Since the airport." She closed her eyes briefly. "You were there." "I was there with roses." He kept his voice flat, not cruel. "I heard everything. I recorded it. Then I went home and made dinner." She opened her eyes. They were wet, but she wasn't crying yet. She was holding it by force of will, the way she held most things. "Evan, I'm not interested in a conversation tonight," he said. "Marcus Hale will be in touch with you this week. He's been my attorney for the past 6 weeks. He has the financial records and the recording and everything else." Her jaw tightened. "You planned this." "I planned to protect myself." "You planned it first." He looked at her steadily. "I hope the company survives, Sabrina. I actually mean that. I just won't be any part of what it's built on." He raised the window. He started the car. He drove home through the November night, and the city looked the same as it always did. The streetlights, the bridges, the dark water. But something in how he moved through it had changed, some fundamental orientation that he couldn't entirely name yet. When he got home, he went to the garage. He turned on the work light over the Impala. He put on the radio. He picked up a wrench and got to work. Marcus filed the divorce petition on a Thursday morning, 8 days after the launch. Evan had asked him to wait a week. Not for sentimental reasons. There was nothing left to be sentimental about. But because he wanted the dust from the event to settle enough that the filing didn't look like a continuation of the same performance. He wasn't interested in theater. What had happened at the venue had been necessary, or at least he'd decided it was necessary, and he was living with that decision without apology. But the divorce itself was a legal matter, not a statement, and he wanted it handled as cleanly as possible. Sabrina had not come back to the house that night, or the night after. By the third day, Evan understood she was staying somewhere else. Marissa's apartment, probably, or possibly a hotel. And he found he didn't need to know which. The house felt different without her in it, but not in the way he might have expected. It didn't feel empty so much as it felt accurately sized for the first time in a while. He slept better than he had in months. The morning Marcus filed, he sent Evan a text that said simply, "Done. Her attorney will be in contact within the week." Evan read it at his desk at work, set the phone face down, and went back to the load calculations he'd been working on. There was nothing else to do right at that moment except the work in front of him, and the work was concrete and specific and required his full attention, which was exactly what he needed it to be. The first contact from Sabrina's attorney came 4 days later. A letter, formal and careful, outlining her initial position. Evan read it with Marcus on a Friday afternoon, the two of them sitting across from each other in Marcus's actual office for the first time since this had started, instead of the coffee shop. She's going to argue that her contributions to the household were non-financial and therefore underdocumented, Marcus said, walking through the letter's points methodically. She'll say that the business development she brought to your professional network during the marriage offset. Some of the financial contributions you made to her company. That's creative, Evan said. It's not without some basis. Courts do consider non-financial contributions. Marcus set the letter down. But it's a weak argument given what we have documented. The financial records are clear. Your original house purchase predates the marriage by 3 years. The trust structure is airtight. She can push, but she's pushing uphill. And the recording? Marcus picked up a pen, turned it once in his fingers. Her attorney hasn't mentioned it directly yet, which tells me they're still deciding how to handle it. It's admissible in this state. You were a party to the conversation, which means you had the legal right to record it. It's not the most flattering piece of evidence she's ever going to have to sit with. He set the pen down. My instinct is they'll try to argue it was taken out of context. Evan looked at him. Out of context? I know, but that's what attorneys do. They find the angle. Marcus leaned back. Here's where we actually are, Evan. She's not in a strong position, and I think she knows it. The launch event accelerated everything. She's lost investors. She's lost the Vale family endorsement. She's under significant public scrutiny about the company's foundation. Her attorney is going to be pragmatic about this because the alternative is a prolonged fight she's unlikely to win. How long? Evan asked. He meant the whole process. If she's reasonable, 6 months, maybe 8. If she decides to make it difficult, longer. Marcus looked at him directly. But I want you to be prepared for something. When people are cornered and scared, they sometimes stop being rational. She might make this harder than it needs to be just because she can. Evan nodded. He'd thought about this. I can wait, he said. What he hadn't prepared for was Evelyn Vale calling him directly. It was a Saturday morning, 10 days after the launch. He was in the garage, where he spent most of his free time now, working on the Impala with increasing consistency, the project coming back to life in direct proportion to how much of his own life he was reclaiming. When his phone rang, and the name on the screen made him put down the socket wrench and sit on the stool for a moment before answering. Evelyn, he said. Evan. Her voice was different from how it usually sounded. The social polish was gone, not replaced by coldness, but stripped down to something more direct. I know you may not want to hear from me. I wanted to call anyway. Okay, he said. A pause. He could hear her breathing, the faint background sound of wherever she was. Outside, it sounded like, maybe her garden. I owe you an apology, she said. I've been thinking about how to say it for 10 days and I keep not finding the right way, so I'm just going to say it plainly. You don't have to. I do, actually. Her voice was firm but not unkind. I stood in that room and I talked about integrity and the meaning of the Vale name, and I had no idea what had actually been going on. Not because you hid it from me. Because I wasn't paying attention to the right things. She paused again. You were in that family for 9 years. I watched you. I knew you were steady and I knew you worked hard and I knew you supported her, and I accepted that as background. The way people accept good weather. You don't think about it, you just enjoy it and assume it'll continue. Evan didn't say anything. I should have paid more attention, Evelyn said. That's what I'm trying to say, not just to what she was doing. I'll have my own conversations with Sabrina, and they won't be comfortable. But to you, as a person, as someone who was part of our family, I took that for granted. Evan looked at the Impala. At the partially reassembled engine, the new gaskets he'd sourced last week, the slowly accumulating evidence of work being done. I appreciate that, Evelyn, he said. He meant it. It didn't fix anything, but he meant it. I want you to know that I'm not trying to punish Sabrina. I'm not going to pretend that what she did was okay, but I'm not. This isn't about revenge. I know, Evelyn said. I think that's actually what makes it harder for her. She could work with anger. It's harder to argue with someone who's just telling the truth. After he hung up, he sat in the garage for a while without working. Evelyn's call had moved something in him that he hadn't expected to be moved. Not because she'd said anything that changed the facts, but because she'd called it all. Because she'd done the harder thing, admitted culpability without being asked to, without an attorney present, without anyone requiring it of her. He thought about what she'd said. You could work with anger. He understood that. Anger was legible. It was something you could navigate around and push back against. But he wasn't angry, or at least anger wasn't the primary thing, and he suspected that was genuinely disorienting for Sabrina, who had probably expected an explosion 6 weeks before the launch, and had been quietly relieved when it didn't come, not understanding that the absence of explosion didn't mean the absence of consequence. The financial negotiations started in earnest 3 weeks into the process. Marcus handled everything directly with Sabrina's attorney, a woman named Patricia Gersh, who had a reputation for being aggressive in early stages, and then more reasonable once she'd established the contours of what she was actually working with. Marcus had dealt with her before and regarded her with the particular professional respect of someone who understood an opponent's tactics. Evan was not present for most of these conversations, which was by design. Marcus kept him updated in careful, structured summaries that Evan read the way he read engineering reports, thoroughly, without emotional inflation, focused on what was real and what was actionable. The house was the most complicated item. Evan's original purchase predated the marriage, and he had documentation showing that the down payment had come from money his father had gifted him specifically for that purpose, several years before Evan met Sabrina. The equity line that had been taken out during the marriage, the one used to fund Vale Collective's first operating year, complicated things, But Marcus had been methodical about establishing that the proceeds had gone directly to the business rather than into the household, which strengthened Evan's argument that the equity had effectively been a contribution to her enterprise rather than a shared marital debt. "She's going to settle on the house," Marcus told him at their fourth-week meeting. "Patricia has been walking her back from some of her initial positions. The equity line will be factored into the overall settlement. She'll take on a portion of the remaining balance as part of the business debt allocation. And the loans I co-signed? We're working out a refinancing arrangement. The two that are still active, she'll need to refinance those into Vail Collective's name alone, which means she needs to find a lender willing to carry them without your credit attached." Paused. "That may be difficult for her right now, given the company's current situation." The company's current situation was not good. Evan knew this from public sources. There had been a brief piece in a local business publication about the launch event, careful and factual, that had mentioned the disruption without speculating too much on its nature. But the disruption itself had been witnessed by enough people that the story had spread through the professional community without needing a formal report. Two of Vail Collective's anchor clients had withdrawn their agreements in the week after the event. The Regional Business Association had quietly declined to move forward with a partnership that had been in discussion for months. And Julian Cross, based on what Marcus had gathered from peripheral sources, had distanced himself from the company's public profile, though his exact status was unclear. Without Evelyn Vail's active endorsement, and Evelyn had made clear, apparently, that she would not be lending her name to the company in its current form, Vail Collective had lost a significant portion of the social and reputational infrastructure that had been part of its market positioning. Evan didn't feel triumph about this. He felt something more complicated, a kind of weariness mixed with a clear-eyed recognition that these were consequences rather than punishments, the natural result of a structure built on something that couldn't hold. Marcus had told him early on that story matters in a divorce proceeding. Evan was beginning to understand that story matters everywhere, and not in a strategic sense, in the most basic sense, in the sense that the story you tell about why you're doing what you're doing is eventually legible to everyone around you, whether or not you make a formal statement. Marissa Bell called him on a Tuesday night in the 5th week. He almost didn't answer. He looked at the name on the screen for several seconds, standing in the kitchen with a pot of water on the stove, and he thought about what she might want and whether he was willing to have the conversation. He answered on the 4th ring. "Evan," she said. Her voice was different from what he expected, quieter than her usual register, without the slight edge that had always been present in their interactions. "Marissa, I know you probably don't want to hear from me." She stopped, started again. "I knew," she said, "about her plan. Not all the details, but I knew she wasn't planning to stay. I knew that for at least 2 years. Evan turned off the burner under the pot. "I know you knew," he said. "She told you at the airport." A pause. "I didn't think it was my place to tell you. I kept telling myself it wasn't my business. It was between the two of you. I couldn't get in the middle of a marriage." She was choosing words carefully, but the guilt was audible underneath them. "I've told myself a lot of things, and none of them really hold up when I look at them straight." "No," he said. "They don't." Another pause. "I'm sorry," she said. "I know that's inadequate." He leaned against the kitchen counter. He thought about what an adequate response to this conversation would look like, and came to the conclusion that there probably wasn't one. Marissa had made her choices over 2 years of knowing something important and deciding the friendship mattered more than the honesty. He could be angry about that, and he had been, briefly, in the early weeks. But Marissa wasn't the central figure in what had happened to him. She was a peripheral one who had made a cowardly decision and was now sitting with it. "I hear you," he said finally. "I'm not going to tell you it doesn't matter that you knew. It does. But I also understand that you were in a position that was genuinely difficult, and people in difficult positions make bad choices." He stopped. "I'm not going to be your absolution, Marissa. That's not something I can give you right now. But I don't hate you for it either." She was quiet for a moment. "How are you doing?" He looked around the kitchen, at the clean counter, the organized cabinets, the plant near the window that he'd remembered to water twice this week, which was more consistently than he'd managed in years. "I'm better than I was," he said. "Getting there." After the call, he stood in the kitchen for a while. Then he made dinner and ate it at the table instead of the counter, which was something he'd been doing more often. sitting at the table, eating a meal like it was an occasion worth the full surface. The divorce was finalized on a gray afternoon in late February, 4 months after Marcus had filed the petition. It had moved faster than Marcus predicted, which spoke to Sabrina's attorney being practical, and Sabrina ultimately making the calculation that a prolonged fight was going to cost her more than it gained her, financially, reputationally, emotionally. The settlement was not perfectly even, and Evan hadn't expected it to be. He kept the house, absorbing a buyout payment that reflected its value during the marriage. The family trust remained entirely untouched, exactly as Marcus had predicted from the beginning. The co-signed loans were being refinanced, a process that was still grinding through slowly but was underway. He took on no business debt from Vale Collective. He signed the final documents in Marcus's conference room at 2 in the afternoon. Marcus had offered to take him to lunch after, or to the coffee shop, or anywhere. Evan said he appreciated it, but he was going to go home. He drove home through the gray afternoon, the kind of February day where the light gives up early and the city looks like it's waiting for something. He parked in the driveway and sat in the car for a minute, which was apparently his thing now. He'd done it after the airport, after the launch, after too many events to count. Sitting in the car was his version of the pause between one thing and the next. He was 42 years old, he had a house, a job he was good at, a father's unfinished car in the garage, and a future that was entirely unscheduled. He went inside. He changed out of his work clothes. He called Donna and told her it was done and listened to her exhale with the specific relief of a sibling who has been worried but trying not to show it. "What now?" she asked. "I don't know yet," he said. "I'm going to sit with that for a little while." "That's okay," she said. "You don't have to know right now." They talked for a while about normal things. Her kids, his job, a problem with her car that he helped her think through over the phone. When he hung up, the house was quiet in the early evening way, the light outside turning that particular shade of February gray-blue. He went to the garage. The Impala was further along than it had been in years. Months of consistent evening work had moved it from stalled to genuinely progressing. The engine was back in place. The interior was partially stripped and waiting on some upholstery work he'd been reading about. The body needed paint, which was a later problem, but the bones of the car were sound. His father had done the harder structural work before his health declined, and Evan had been building on that foundation steadily, evening by evening, wrench by wrench. He put on the radio and looked at the car for a moment before getting to work. His father had been a difficult man in some respects, impatient, hard to read emotionally, better with machines than with words. But he had loved this car with the uncomplicated directness of someone who believed that a thing worth doing was worth doing completely, and he had started this project intending to see it finished. He hadn't gotten to finish it. That wasn't his fault. But the project was still here, still viable, still the same car it had always been underneath the years and the interrupted work. Evan picked up a wrench. He worked for 2 hours, then 3. The radio moved through an evening's worth of music while he worked, and at some point he realized he'd stopped keeping track of the time, which hadn't happened to him in months. He was just in the work, just present with the specific problem in front of him, his hands knowing what to do and doing it. He was not over what had happened. He didn't think it worked that way. He didn't think you just moved through a 9-year marriage that turned out to be something other than you believed and came out the other side intact and clean. There was going to be more to sit with. There were going to be evenings that were harder than this one. He'd call Donna on some of those evenings, and she'd listen, and he'd be in the garage on others, and the radio would be enough. But right now, on this specific February evening, with the tools in his hands and the car taking shape under his attention, he felt something settle in him. Not resolved, not finished, just grounded. In his own space, in his own time, working on something that was his entirely, that no one had asked him to do and no one was waiting to benefit from except him. The garage smelled like oil and cold concrete and the specific metallic smell of old tools his father had used before him. He kept working. Spring came slowly that year, the way it does in cities that have had a hard winter, tentatively, in increments, a warm afternoon followed by 3 cold days, flowers appearing and then getting frostbitten and persisting anyway, because that's what flowers do. Evan noticed it more than he usually would have. He'd always been the kind of person who moved through seasons without paying much attention to them, too occupied with the interior weather of work and marriage and the accumulated logistics of a shared life. But the house was his alone now, And when you're alone in a house, you tend to notice things you previously outsourced to the ambient noise of another person's presence. The light changing in the kitchen in the morning. The way the backyard looked in early March when the ground was still hard, but something underneath was starting to move. He'd planted things in the backyard. This surprised him slightly. He'd never been a gardener, had never had any particular interest in it. But one Saturday in early March, he'd found himself at a nursery near his house, standing in front of a table of seedlings with a cart he didn't remember picking up. And he'd bought tomato plants and 2 kinds of herbs and a climbing rose for the back fence. And he'd spent the afternoon digging in cold dirt with his bare hands and felt completely, inexplicably okay. The Impala was close now. That was the other thing that was happening in the background of his daily life. The steady accumulation of progress in the garage that he'd come to think of as a kind of parallel narrative to everything else. The car getting closer to finished as his own life got clearer in its outlines. He'd gotten the engine running in January, a Saturday morning that he hadn't planned for anything in particular, just working through the checklist the way he always did, and then the engine had turned over and caught, and the sound of it in the closed garage had been so unexpected and so complete that he'd sat on the concrete floor for a moment with his back against the car and just listened to it idle. He'd called Donna immediately. "It runs," he said when she picked up. A pause. "The Impala?" "Yeah." "Evan." Her voice did something complicated. "Dad would have—" "I know," he said. He didn't need her to finish it. He was still doing the bodywork, which was the slower part, the part that required the most patience and the most tolerance for imperfection. The understanding that you could work a panel for an hour and make it look worse before it looked better, that the process wasn't linear and didn't always feel like progress even when it was. His father had known this, had been willing to sit with it. Evan was learning it. Marcus called him in mid-March with the final confirmation that the loan refinancing had gone through. Sabrina had found a lender willing to carry the remaining balances in Vale Collective's name alone, which meant Evan's name was off everything. It had taken longer than expected, required some negotiation, and Marcus suspected Sabrina had taken on terms that weren't favorable to her, but it was done. "You're clear," Marcus said. Evan was at his desk at work when the call came. He put the phone down after and looked out the window at the March sky, which was doing one of its in-between things. Partly overcast, a bar of pale yellow light along the horizon where the clouds were thinner, clear. It was a strange word for it. I wasn't sure he felt clear in the way Marcus meant. Free of legal obligation? Yes, but the other kind of clear, the internal kind, was more complicated and more gradual. He was getting there. He could feel the direction of travel even when he couldn't feel the speed. He ran into Julian Cross by accident on a Wednesday afternoon in late March. He'd been at a coffee place near a client's office, waiting for a meeting, and Cross had come in while Evan was standing at the counter. They'd seen each other at the same moment, which meant neither of them had the option of a clean exit. Cross looked like a man who had been having a difficult few months, which he probably had. He was still well-dressed. That appeared to be constitutional rather than circumstantial. But there was something in his face that hadn't been in his professional photo, a quality of a person who has been reassessing things. They looked at each other for a moment. "Mercer," Cross said. "Cross," Evan said. The barista was waiting. Cross ordered his drink and stepped to the side, and Evan had the brief, genuine option of taking his drink to a far table and leaving it at that. Instead, he stayed at the counter. "I'm not going to make a scene," Evan said, keeping his voice quiet. "That's not what this is." Cross looked at him with an expression that was hard to read but had something like relief in it. "I wasn't sure." "I don't imagine you were." Evan picked up his drink. He thought about what, if anything, was worth saying. "I don't know exactly what you and Sabrina were to each other, and I've decided I don't need to know, but I want to say one thing." Cross was quiet, watching him. "She told her best friend she was with me because I was safe and dependable," Evan said. "Not because she wanted to be, because I was useful. And you, whatever you were the thing she actually wanted." He paused. "That's a painful thing to find out about your marriage. But it's also useful information, if you look at it straight, because it means I was spending 9 years in the wrong equation, and now I'm not." Cross looked at him for a long moment. "For what it's worth," he said slowly, It wasn't what I understood it to be either. I didn't know she was planning." He stopped, reconsidered. "I should have asked more questions. I knew she was married, and I told myself a story about why that was okay, and I let myself believe it because I wanted to. He said it without flinching, which Evan noted. I'm not asking you to think well of me for saying that. I don't think much about you either way, Evan said, honestly. I'm just telling you what I know. He took his drink and went to his meeting. On the drive back to the office afterward, he turned that conversation over in his mind. He hadn't planned it, hadn't rehearsed it, hadn't known what he was going to say until he said it. But it had come out the way things come out when you've done enough thinking about something that the thinking starts to take the shape of clarity. Not the forced clarity of someone who's decided how to feel, but the organic kind that arrives when you've stopped fighting the actual truth of a situation and just let it be what it is. He had been in the wrong equation. That was the plainest way to put it. Not because there was something wrong with him, not because he'd been a bad husband or an inadequate person. He'd been, if anything, exactly what he was, straightforwardly and without performance. But because the equation itself had been constructed around a different set of assumptions than the ones he'd been operating on. You can do everything right inside a wrong equation and still come out with a wrong answer. He'd been doing that for 9 years. He wasn't doing it anymore. Sabrina called him once, in early April. He answered, because he'd decided months ago that he wasn't going to be the kind of person who refused to pick up a phone call from someone he'd spent 9 years with, regardless of what those 9 years had actually contained. He wasn't obligated to have a long conversation, but he could answer. Evan, she said. Sabrina. A pause, the kind that meant she'd prepared something and was now unsure whether to say it the way she'd prepared it. I've been trying to figure out what to say to you for months. I've written it down. I've practiced it. And I keep... She stopped. I keep feeling like anything I say is going to sound like I'm doing it for myself, to feel better about myself. And I don't want to call you just to make myself feel better. He sat with that for a second. Then why are you calling? Because I think you deserve to hear me say, out loud, that I used you. Not by accident, and not because I didn't know what I was doing. I knew what I was doing, and I did it anyway. And I told myself it was okay because I had feelings for you, even if they weren't the kind you thought they were. And because I believed the company would succeed, and somehow that would retroactively justify it. Her voice was steady, but barely. That's not a justification. I'm not presenting it as one. I'm telling you because I think if the situation were reversed, you'd want to know that I understood what I'd actually done. Evan was sitting in the backyard when this call came, on a Saturday afternoon in early April, the kind of day that had finally committed to being spring, warm enough for a jacket, the yard showing the first real green at the edges. The tomato seedlings he'd planted were still small but had survived 2 cold snaps and were standing up. He thought about what to say for a moment, and he was honest enough to recognize that what he wanted to say and what was true were not exactly the same thing. He wanted to say something sharp, something that would land with weight, something that would make her understand with her whole body what those 9 years had felt like from his side. But that impulse wasn't about truth. It was about the last of the hurt looking for somewhere to put itself. I believe you understand it, he said finally. I'm not sure I believe it changes much, but I believe you understand it. She was quiet. Is there anything I can... No, he said, not harshly. There isn't. We're done with the legal side. The rest of it is just time. Another pause. The company is... It's not in a good place, she said. I'm not telling you that for sympathy. I just want you to know that I understand it's a consequence, not something that happened to me. He looked at the tomato seedlings. I hope you can rebuild it, he said. I genuinely do. Not what it was, but something honest. He meant this. He was sometimes surprised by how much he meant it. You're actually good at the work, Sabrina. That part was always real. She didn't say anything for a moment, and he thought he heard her breath catch, just slightly. Take care of yourself, he said. You too, she said. He set the phone down on the arm of the chair and sat in the spring afternoon for a while. A bird somewhere in the back of the yard was making a repetitive sound he couldn't identify. The climbing rose he'd planted on the back fence had put out 3 leaves, small and bright green, improbable against the old wood of the fence. He felt something loosen in him. Not dramatically, not in any way that would make a good story if he tried to describe it to someone. Just a small, specific easing, like a knot that has been pulled at for months, finally giving slightly. Not undone, but giving. The thing about being the steady one, the reliable one, the one who is valued for being present and constant and not creating problems. The thing nobody tells you about that role is how much it can cost you without your consent. You sign up for it usually because it's what you're good at, or because someone you love seems to need it, or because early in your life someone showed you that this was what it meant to be a person worth keeping around. And you do it genuinely because you're not performing. You actually are that way. It's actually who you are. But somewhere along the way, without anyone formally announcing it, the role becomes the relationship, and the relationship becomes a structure in which your value is entirely defined by your function. Evan had not fully understood this while it was happening to him. He understood it now, more clearly than he'd like to, because understanding something fully usually requires getting it wrong first. He wanted to be clear, even to himself, sitting in the garage on a Saturday evening in May, with the radio on and the Impala nearly finished, a cautionary tale. He didn't think of himself that way, and he didn't think the lesson of what had happened to him was that love is a con, or that generosity is weakness, or that you should protect yourself by withholding. He'd met people who'd come to those conclusions after being hurt, and he understood how you got there, but he didn't think it was right. The lesson, if there was one he could name honestly, was simpler and more difficult than that. It was about the difference between being present in your own life and being useful to someone else's. Those two things can overlap. In a good marriage, in a good friendship, in a good working relationship, they do overlap, substantially and genuinely. But when one starts to replace the other, when your presence in your own life gradually gets redirected entirely into the service of someone else's goals, the loss is slow enough that you might not notice it until something breaks the spell. For him, the spell was broken by a laugh in an airport terminal. For other people, it's broken by other things. Sometimes it's broken too late to do much about it. He understood he was fortunate, if that was the word, that his version of this had a recognizable breakpoint, a moment of clarity that was brutal but also undeniable. He'd been 42 when he set those roses down on a luggage cart and walked out of the terminal. He was still 42 for another 3 weeks, and then he'd be 43, which was not old and was not young and was exactly the age he was. And the number of useful years in front of him depended entirely on what he decided to do with them. He was working on deciding. The Impala was finished on a Saturday in late May. Not fully finished in the perfectionist sense, there was still detail work he wanted to do on the interior, and the paint job was something he'd planned to take to a professional shop rather than attempt himself, which meant the car was still in primer. But it ran, all systems worked correctly, it drove, and on the morning of the last Saturday of May, Evan rolled it out of the garage and into the driveway for the first time in the years since his father had last moved it. He stood next to it in the morning light and looked at it for a moment. His neighbor across the street, a retired man named Gerald, who had lived on the block for 30 years and had an opinion about every car that had ever come through the neighborhood, came to the edge of his driveway and looked. "Is that a 67? Gerald called. "67? Evan confirmed. Gerald walked across the street with the deliberate gait of a man who takes cars seriously. He walked around the Impala slowly, examining it without theatrics, the way people who know about cars actually look at them. "Your dad's?" he said finally. "Yeah." He'd started work on this back. Gerald looked up. "Must be 5 years ago. 6? "He got about 40% through before he couldn't keep going," Evan said. "I've been finishing it." Gerald stood back and looked at the car from a few feet away. "Good bodywork," he said, which from Gerald was the equivalent of a standing ovation. "Still needs paint." "Still needs paint," Gerald agreed. "But the bones are right." He looked at Evan. "You planning to sell it?" "No," Evan said. He hadn't hesitated, which told him something. Gerald nodded as if this was the correct answer and walked back across the street. Evan drove the car that afternoon. Just around the neighborhood at first, feeling how it handled, listening to the engine, paying attention to how the suspension felt on different surfaces. His father had been meticulous about mechanical fundamentals, and that meticulousness had preserved the car's driving quality through years of sitting and incomplete work. The steering was responsive. The engine was steady. It wasn't a new car and it didn't drive like one. There was weight to it, a particular road feel that modern cars didn't have, the specific sensation of something built before anyone decided that lightness and efficiency were the highest virtues. He drove it out of this neighborhood and onto the longer roads, and after a while he turned onto the highway and opened it up a little, and the car did what it was built to do. He thought about his father on the drive. This was not unusual. He'd been thinking about his father throughout the whole restoration project, in the way that working on something a person left behind tends to keep them present in a specific, grounded way that's different from ordinary grief. His father was present in the car, in the work that had been done right, in the places where Evan had found a fastener that had been replaced at some point with the correct grade of hardware, in the careful approach to the engine that Evan had tried to honor in his own work. His father's hands had been on these parts before his. He'd asked his father once, when he was maybe 14 or 15, why he spent so much time on old cars. The question had been slightly dismissive, the way a teenager's questions often are, edged with the implication that this was not a particularly interesting way to spend time. His father had looked at him for a moment, the way he looked at things he was deciding how to approach. Because they tell you the truth, his father had said. A machine is either working or it isn't. You can't talk it into working. You can't pretend it's working when it isn't. You either do the work or you don't. Evan had not fully understood this at 15. He understood it now. There were people in the world who were like the machines his father described. What you saw was what you got. The function matched the appearance. The thing was what it said it was. And there were other arrangements, other situations, other relationships in which what you saw and what was actually, there were different things entirely, and no amount of good faith and genuine effort on your part could change the underlying reality of that mismatch. He'd spent 9 years in the second kind of situation. He was not going to spend another 9 years in it. Not because he'd become cynical, not because he'd decided that trust was a risk he wasn't willing to take. He didn't believe that, and he didn't want to believe it. But because he now understood the difference, in his actual body, in the way you understand things that have cost you something real. He would know the difference going forward. That was not nothing. Donna came to visit in June, the first time she'd made the trip in over 2 years. She arrived on a Friday evening, and Evan picked her up from the train station, and they had dinner at a place near the house that he'd been going to regularly, a small Italian restaurant run by a family that had been in the neighborhood for decades. The kind of place where the menu didn't change much, and the food was reliably good, and the owner knew your face after 3 visits. "You look different," Donna said over dinner. "Different how?" She considered it. She had their father's directness, which Evan had always appreciated even when it landed hard. "Less like someone holding something together," she said. "More like someone just sitting in a chair." He thought about that. "I'll take it," he said. She asked about the Impala, and he told her it was running, and her face did the same thing it had done on the phone in January, that complicated mix of happiness and something older underneath it. She'd been closer to their father than Evan had, in some ways, or closer to the version of him that his illness had softened. "Can I see it tomorrow?" she asked. "Yeah," he said. "I'm taking it to the paint shop next week. You can see it before it goes in." "What color?" "The original color," he said. "It came off the factory in a dark green, almost black in low light, green in the sun." He paused. "Dad chose the color. I'm not changing it." Donna was quiet for a moment. "That's right," she said. Not enthusiastically, but with the particular steadiness of someone confirming that a thing was correct. On Saturday morning, she stood in the driveway and looked at the car the same way Gerald had, with the seriousness it deserved. And then she said, "It's good work, Evan." And he understood she meant more than the car. Later that afternoon, they sat on the back porch with drinks and talked in the way they hadn't talked in years. Not about anything in particular, not about Sabrina or the divorce or what came next. Just about the ordinary texture of their lives, work and neighbors and things they'd been reading and a mutual friend who'd recently done something bewildering and funny. The yard was green. The tomatoes had gotten tall while Evan wasn't paying close attention and had to be staked. The climbing rose had put out its first proper blooms, small and pale pink, slightly ragged at the edges. Not the picture-perfect blooms of a florist display, but real ones, with their own particular imperfect grace. He'd bought 12 red roses at a shop near his office once, and left them on a luggage cart in an airport terminal. He thought about that man sometimes, the man with the roses, leaving work early with a slightly embarrassed sense that the gesture might help, believing in the good faith of a marriage that was, from the inside of someone else's mind, already something else. He thought about him with more tenderness than he would have expected. That man had not been stupid. He had not been willfully blind. He had been someone who defaulted to trust, who believed that the context he was in was the context that actually existed, who had enough decency that it hadn't occurred to him that the person he was driving to the airport for might be performing a version of the marriage rather than living it. That quality, the decency, the default to trust, he was not interested in losing it. It had cost him something, and he was aware of the cost. But the alternative was a kind of preemptive suspicion that he'd watched other people carry, and it looked heavy and cold, and it didn't seem to make them safer, only lonelier. He was going to keep trusting. He was going to be more careful about what he verified and what he assumed, more attentive to the difference between what someone said and what they showed him over time, more willing to ask the questions that felt uncomfortable rather than waiting for the context to reassure him. He was going to pay attention, but he was not going to stop trusting because distrust as a permanent operating mode was its own kind of damage, and he'd been through enough damage for one season of his life. He was 43 years old, or close enough to it. The house was his. The car, his father's car, finished at last, would be painted the color his father had chosen for it, and Evan would drive it on Saturday mornings with the windows down. The tomatoes would be ready by August. The rose on the back fence was blooming. None of this was what he'd planned 5 years ago or 9 years ago or even a year ago. The future he was living in now was not the future he'd been building toward for most of his adult life. He'd built toward something else, carefully and in good faith, and what he'd been building had turned out to be standing on ground that wasn't solid. But here was what he'd learned in the garage, working on an engine that needed to be understood from the inside out before it could run. You don't need the original foundation to still be there. You need to understand what's actually in front of you, do the work honestly, use the right materials, and refuse to pretend something is finished when it isn't. The car had been waiting for years for someone to stop pretending the work didn't need doing. So had he. The evening came in slowly over the backyard, the light shifting the way it does in June, when the days are long and the dark takes its time. Donna was on her phone for a few minutes, checking something, and Evan sat in the quiet and looked at the yard and thought about nothing in particular and everything at once, which is what the mind does when it finally has room to move. He was not, at this moment, happy in the uncomplicated sense. He was something more durable than that, something that didn't have a clean word for it, though the closest he'd gotten was simply present. He was present in his own life, not performing it, not managing it, not keeping it stable for someone else's benefit, just in it, his own time, his own yard, his own evening. That was where he was. The man who had walked out of an airport terminal with empty hands had arrived by an unexpected road here. It was enough. More than enough. It was, in the most ordinary and unadorned sense of the word, his. Donna left on Sunday afternoon, and the house went quiet again, in that particular way it did after a visitor. Not empty exactly, but recalibrated, the rooms reasserting their normal dimensions after having been filled with another person's energy for 2 days. Evan stood in the kitchen after her car disappeared around the corner and thought about making coffee, and then decided on it and made it, and stood at the counter drinking it slowly while the afternoon light moved across the floor. He'd gotten used to this. The quiet, the pace of a single person's Sunday, which had its own particular texture that was neither lonely nor celebratory, but simply specific. He was learning to be specific about his own life in a way he hadn't been in years. Not broad strokes, the marriage, the mortgage, the shared calendar, but specific. This coffee, this light, this particular Sunday with the smell of Donna's visit still faintly in the house. He called Marcus in the evening, not for any legal reason. There was no legal reason left. Everything was settled and documented and done. But because Marcus had become, over the course of the past several months, something different from just his attorney. He'd always been a friend, technically, but the word had been abstract before. Now it was concrete. There were people in your life who you find out are genuinely there when the situation removes all the comfortable social scaffolding, and Marcus had been one of those people, and Evan wasn't going to pretend otherwise. "Everything okay?" Marcus asked when he picked up. "Yeah, Donna just left. I'm having coffee." "How was the visit?" "Good. Really good, actually." Evan set down the cup. "She cried a little when she saw the car run. Don't tell her I told you that." Marcus laughed. "The Impala is finished? Almost. Going to the paint shop Tuesday. 8 to 10 days, they said." He paused. "I keep walking out to the garage to look at it, and then remembering it won't be there." That's a good problem to have, Marcus said. You know what that is? That's anticipation. Most people forget what anticipation feels like when they've been in survival mode for a long time. Evan thought about that. Survival mode, he said. Is that what it was? For a while. Yeah. Marcus's voice was a matter of fact, without drama. You held it together very well, for the record. Better than most people would have. I didn't feel like I was holding it together. I felt like I was just continuing. That's what holding it together looks like from the inside, Marcus said. From the outside, it looks different. After the call, Evan rinsed the coffee cup and put it in the drying rack and stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the backyard in the Sunday evening light. He thought about what Marcus had said. Survival mode. He hadn't thought of the past several months in those terms while he was in them. He'd thought of it as getting through, which was a different framing, something more active, more deliberate. But maybe that was just the same thing with a different name. Maybe surviving and getting through were the same motion, and the difference was just whether you felt like an agent or a patient in the process. He had felt, most of the time, like an agent. He'd made decisions, documented things, hired an attorney, gone to the launch with a plan, signed the divorce papers, answered the calls from Evelyn and Marissa and Sabrina. He'd done all of it deliberately. Whether that was holding it together or just continuing, he supposed it didn't really matter. The result was the same. He was here. The house was his. The car was running. The tomatoes needed staking. He thought about Sabrina less than he expected to as the summer came on. This surprised him at first, and then he understood it. The version of Sabrina he had grieved was the version he'd believed in, the woman he thought he'd married, the partnership he thought he'd been building. That version had ceased to exist, not at the airport but retroactively, stretching back across 9 years. And you couldn't grieve a person in the present tense when what you were grieving was a version of them that had never been fully real. The grief was already done, or mostly done, because it had started the moment he heard her voice in that terminal and had run its course in the weeks and months of sitting with what was actually true. The Sabrina who had called him in April and told him, with genuine difficulty, that she had used him, that Sabrina he didn't hate. He didn't have warm feelings toward her, but he didn't hate her. She was a person who had made decisions she could justify to herself for long enough that they became structural, who had discovered only when the structure collapsed publicly that the justifications hadn't been as solid as she'd believed. He understood how that happened to people. He didn't understand it from the inside of that particular experience, but he could see the shape of it clearly enough. He had heard, indirectly, through a professional contact who knew someone connected to Vale Collective, that Sabrina was attempting to rebuild the company in a significantly reduced form. Fewer clients, smaller scope, no more Vale family name attached, just the work itself, whatever it was worth on its own merits. He didn't know if it would succeed or fail, and he found he genuinely didn't need to. He had meant what he said to her on the phone. She was actually good at the work. What happened to the company was going to depend on things he had no part in anymore. Julian Cross, according to the same peripheral information, was no longer involved with Vale Collective in any professional capacity. What that said about the personal side of things, Evan didn't know and didn't pursue. The Impala came back from the paint shop on a Thursday evening in late June, and the man from the shop drove it into the driveway and handed Evan the keys with the particular pride of someone who has done good work and knows it. The color was exactly what his father had chosen, all those years ago. Dark green, so dark it read almost black in the garage light, but in the long, angled light of a June evening it showed its true color. A deep, specific green that reminded Evan of something he couldn't immediately name, and then could. The color of the lake where his father had taken him fishing as a kid, in the early morning before the sun was fully up, when the water held the light in a way that made it look solid. He stood in the driveway and looked at it for a long time. Gerald came across the street again, drawn by some automotive instinct. He didn't say anything for a while, just walked around the car the way he'd done before, slowly, taking in the finished paintwork with the same serious attention. "That's the right color," Gerald said finally. "It's the original," Evan said. "I know. I remember when your father bought it." Gerald stopped at the rear of the car and looked back at Evan. "He talked about this car for years. Used to say he was going to get it right eventually." Evan hadn't known this. "He never mentioned that to me." "He mentioned it to everyone else," Gerald said, with the dry affection of a long-term neighbor. He was proud of you, not just of the car, of you. Evan looked at the car and said nothing for a moment. The thing about grief, real grief, the kind that has had time to settle and become part of the landscape rather than a fresh wound, is that it can be moved by small things, not split open, but moved. Gerald saying a thing that Evan already knew was probably true, but had never heard said out loud in that particular way, moved something in him, quietly, without announcement. "Thank you," he said, "for saying that." Gerald waved a hand as if it required no thanks and went back across the street. Evan stood in the driveway in the June evening with his father's car finished at last beside him and let himself feel the full weight of it for a moment. Not the sadness only, but everything mixed together the way things actually are. The loss and the completion and the pride and the strange grace of finishing something someone else started, of honoring a beginning you didn't choose by seeing it through to an end. He drove it that evening, longer than before, out of the city and onto the roads that opened up past the suburbs, where the driving was different. The long straightaways, the easy curves, the way the headlights cut ahead of you into the summer dark. The engine ran the way it was supposed to run, steady and substantial, the sound of it filling the car in a way that modern cars didn't, a physical presence rather than a background hum. He drove for about an hour and a half, no particular destination, just driving. The radio was on low, an oldies station, which felt right for the car, and he found he didn't need to change it. He drove through small towns, past gas stations and diners, and the particular American nighttime landscape of lit signs and dark parking lots and houses with the blue flicker of television behind their windows. He thought about the man he'd been when this all started, and the man he was now, and whether those two men were more different or more alike. He thought they were more alike than the story might suggest. He'd been a careful, methodical, decent person before the airport, and he was a careful, methodical, decent person now. He'd lost some naivety, which was appropriate and probably long overdue. He'd gained something harder to name, not toughness exactly, because he didn't think he'd been particularly soft before. More like a clearer knowledge of his own outline, where he ended and where other people's plans for him began. He knew that outline now. He would not be so easily talked out of it. There was a woman at his office named Caroline Driscoll who worked in project coordination and had, over the course of the spring, become someone he had genuine conversations with, not the professionally cordial kind that filled office hallways, but the actual kind. The kind where you lose track of time and then notice that 20 minutes have passed and neither of you has moved toward the exit. She knew he was recently divorced. She'd mentioned at some point that she'd been through a difficult end to a long relationship 2 years before, which she'd described with the specific shorthand of someone who has processed something thoroughly enough that they can reference it without being swallowed by it. He hadn't made any overtures. He wasn't ready, or he wasn't sure he was ready, which amounted to the same thing. But he noticed her, and he noticed the noticing, which was itself new. The fact of being capable of noticing, of having that particular alertness return to him after months of it being entirely redirected toward the work of ending his marriage. One Thursday in early July, they ended up leaving the building at the same time and walking to the parking lot in the same direction, and she asked what he was driving these days, and he told her about the Impala, and she said she'd never heard a restored car described like that before, like something that mattered for reasons beyond the car. "It does matter for reasons beyond the car," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why I said it." They stood at the edge of the parking lot for a while, in the way that people stand when neither of them is quite ready for the natural end of a conversation. I thought about asking if she wanted to get coffee, or to see the car sometime, or any number of things that were available to him in that moment. He didn't ask. Not yet. Not because he was afraid exactly, but because he was being deliberate in a way he hadn't always been. Paying attention to the difference between an impulse and a readiness, which his father had also been good at, in his own impatient way. His father had waited years to start the car. He'd waited until he had the right tools, the right knowledge, the right time, and the car had been worth waiting for. He said goodnight and drove home. But he thought about the conversation on the drive, and he thought about it again later in the backyard with the evening coming in and the tomatoes standing tall against their stakes, and he noted the fact of the thinking without doing anything about it, which felt like its own kind of rightness. He was in no rush. The summer was long. He had a house and a running car and a yard that was growing things, and he had time, not the provisional borrowed time of someone living inside another person's plan, but his own time, genuinely his, to do with as he decided. That was the thing he kept coming back to, the thing that still surprised him in small moments, the quiet, fundamental fact of his own time. He had spent so many years with his time oriented towards someone else's trajectory, shaped around another person's needs and goals and timeline, that the simple reality of an unstructured evening, no obligations, no performance, just the backyard and the rows on the fence, and the sound of the neighborhood settling into night, felt like something he had to keep relearning, not because it was unpleasant, but because it was so different from what he'd been that the difference itself took some getting used to. He didn't need anyone to validate this. That was another thing he'd learned, slower and more personally than the legal and financial lessons. The version of himself that had shown up at an airport with roses had been, in part, a man who needed the gesture to be received well in order for it to feel worthwhile. The reception was supposed to confirm something, that the effort meant something, that the stability and reliability he brought to the marriage meant something, that he meant something beyond his function. He'd needed that confirmation because somewhere along the way he'd stopped being sure of it on his own. He was sure of it now. Not in a loud way, not in a way that required announcement, just he knew what he was worth, in the same plain, specific way he knew what a load-bearing structure was worth. You didn't need someone to tell you. You could see it in the work. The roses he'd left on that luggage cart were long gone, of course. Somebody had probably thrown them away within the hour, or maybe a cleaning crew had found them and wondered briefly about the story. It didn't matter. What he'd carried to the airport that afternoon, the willingness, the care, the genuine belief that showing up was the right thing to do, those hadn't been left behind on any cart. They'd come home with him. They were still his. He was just going to be more careful about who he offered them to next time. The summer evening held its warmth late, the way summer evenings do when the season is fully arrived and confident in itself. Somewhere down the street, somebody was grilling, and the smell of it drifted over the fence and into the yard, where Evan sat with nothing urgent to do and nowhere particular to be. He breathed in the summer air, the grilled smoke and the green smell of the garden, and he sat in his own time, in his own yard, in the life that was fully and completely and at last his own. It wasn't a perfect life. It wasn't the life he'd planned. It was better than both of those things. It was the life he'd actually built, on honest ground, with his own hands. And that, it turned out, was more than enough. He went to bed that night without setting an alarm. This was something he'd started doing on weekends, not every weekend, but more often than before, just leaving the morning open, letting his body decide when it was done sleeping, rather than being pulled out of it by obligation. His father had thought this was laziness when Evan was young. Now Evan thought his father had been wrong about that particular thing, which was allowed. You could admire someone completely and still think they were wrong about specific things. That was what it meant to see a person clearly instead of just loving an idea of them. He woke at 7:30, which was not sleeping in by most definitions, but felt unhurried. The light in the bedroom was the particular gold of an early summer morning, coming through the curtains at a low angle, landing on the floor in a shape that shifted slowly as the sun moved. He lay there and watched it for a few minutes without reaching for his phone. He thought about Caroline Driscoll, briefly, the way you think about something that is not yet a plan but is beginning to have the shape of one. He thought about the Impala, which he was going to drive this morning, no destination, just the road and the engine and the summer air. He thought about the tomatoes, which needed checking, and the rose on the back fence, which had put out new blooms overnight, small and imperfect and entirely real. He got up. He made coffee. He stood at the kitchen window and looked at the yard in the morning light, at the garden he hadn't planned to plant, and the car he'd taken years to finish, and the house that was, finally and without condition, his. He was not the man who had walked into that airport terminal with 12 red roses, full of hope, aimed in the wrong direction. He was something more durable than that man. He drank his coffee, and the morning began.